We mentioned earlier this week that language, of course, can be more or less reproduced by machines, and that comes with a basic understanding of how language works, of course, and that you can parse language in various ways and make new languages out of that. But the underlying function behind that is one of logic. And this is what was pointed out in that same quote that appeared in the previous lecture. Every interesting work is being done in programming computers to solve problems which require a high degree of intelligence in humans. However, certain elementary verbal reasoning processes so simple that they can be carried out by any non-feeble-minded human have yet to be simulated by machine programs. And in that case here, being able to figure out the basic functioning of these word problems would allow for people to make an eventually a human-like language, or language that sounds human enough. And once you understand the logic behind it and you connect the human logic of language with the computer logic of people, you can make sense out of how there is a much larger process of putting the pieces of a language together. And of course, for our purposes in this class, this also has to do with our understanding of the logic of the world as it exists. And this is a problem that was identified pretty early on for people who were looking at these computer languages, because if you can organize the human language in terms of these very basic algorithms, or these very basic logical solutions, if you will, then you may be able to create a form of reference that might exist outside of the language itself. And of course, and the people who have been studying these programs have been also trying to make sense out of what this would mean for the world around us, that we could reorganize the logic of our world according to the logic of the computer's languages. Here is an approximate second order definition of belief, says McCarthy, who thought that, in fact, languages spoken by machines could be equated with a form of belief. For each state S of the machine and each sentence B in a suitable language L, we assign truth to B as P, or the function of B is P, if and only if the machine is considered to believe P when it is in state S. The language L is chosen for our convenience, and there is no assumption that the machine explicitly represents sentences of L in any way. Thus, we can talk about the beliefs of Chinese, dogs, corporation thermostats, and computer operating systems without assuming that they use English as our favorite first-order language. L may or may not be the language we are using for making other assertions. E.g., we could, writing in English, systematically use French sentences as objects of belief. However, the best choice for artificial intelligence work may be to make L a subset of the outer language restricted so as to avoid the paradoxical self-references of Montague, 1963. And in our case here, being able to believe for the context of machines would be something that seems rather scary for a lot of people. You would think that the machines being able to understand the world around them and essentially make that their belief, in other words, make that their state of mind. So the machine reads the situation around them, in this case here, a thermostat, being able to read the temperature, uh, starts acting in a way that would solve the temperatures that it sees. And in this case here, turning the temperature up or down based on whether it quote unquote believes or quote unquote assumes that the temperature is too hot or too cold. And that becomes a very realistic problem for philosophy and for the people who are looking at the world around us, because there is the possibility of thinking now in terms of a world that is not just a world connecting by machines, but also a world that is believed by machines or put into a certain state of machines. And perhaps that would lead us to a larger re-questioning of truth itself. And in fact, this is how this argument went for philosophy as a whole, because it became a redefinition of what people tend to think of as belief, as truth. And all of that has to do with the way that information is structured after all. because understanding how the language works is a matter of understanding those things that we take for granted in our world, in our beliefs of the world themselves. So the two sentences here with "it was my cat that got lost" and "what happened to my cat was that it got lost," those two sentences here kind of seek to make sense out of those assumptions that exist in people's minds, or again, those beliefs that people might have. So if you're saying the sentence, "it was my cat that got lost," it emphasizes the fact that my cat got lost, as opposed to, on the other hand, "what happened to my cat was that it got lost," it emphasizes the part where the cat got lost. In both of these situations, the sentence could have been as easily, "my cat got lost." It could, perhaps, through language, be emphasized as in, "my cat got lost," or "my cat got lost," putting the emphasis on the different part of the sentence. But for the purpose of making those things clear, we also have the possibility of making a language that makes the part of speech a little bit more obvious in the first two sentences on this slide. Now, the things that we suppose, or the things that we imply, or the things that we do not say in any kind of way when we are using the language are the things that end up as part of the logic of our system, and perhaps out of the logic of my world. If you see the sentence, "my cat got lost," you assume that I have a cat, or that the person who is talking has a cat, I guess, be reading this sentence. If you read the sentence, "my cat got lost," you assume that the cat is a cat that does not typically get lost, and this is a house cat. So this is not just a, tiger that happens to live in my backyard or whatever it is. So those things that are legitimately part of my world as my belief that I share with you right now, listening to this particular sentence coming out of my mouth, is a thing that we would declare as our state of affairs, and the things that make the world around us, more or less meaningful, as opposed to all the infinite possibilities that exist out there. And people in the world of philosophy try to make sense out of these things in terms of mathematics, once again, or calculus, that you may be able to calculate the truth value of a sentence by using a certain form of mathematics that sees the assumptions that are made, where the conditions of the equation would turn out to be true or false. So the course of values of the concept f is identical to the course of values of the concept g if and only if f and g agree on the value of every argument, i.e., if and only if for every object x is a factor of fx equals gx. Now, again, we are reducing value in terms of um, a logical relationship, and in fact this is something that we have to do as part of our normal language processing in our brain, and this is something that can be reproduced for the context of a machine, in that if you are talking to a machine, the machine may be able to make that same equation to have that same belief that you have, or understand that same thing that you have said, if you will. That if you tell your computer, "my cat got lost," then your computer will have to assume the fact that you have a cat. It will have to assume the fact that your cat can get lost, etc., because without that, the machine does not know anything. The machine is just a machine. Does this thing at this point in time, once it is collected as data, it is parsed as data within the computer's brain, does it become a form of belief? And understanding those forms of belief is becoming a factor of our identity in the world, or the identity of the things in the world compared to the things that are in our minds, and whether those things are matching or connecting in particular ways is also a matter of logic. People think of themselves in a certain way as of their place in the world, just like they believe in the world around them, that ends up becoming part of their identity as a whole. And again, this has been formulated in terms of mathematical equations, because when it comes to understanding truth as a whole. It becomes a matter of the connections of the concepts that exist in the world and the concepts that exist in the reality of the things that we know, such as a simple mathematical addition, for example, here, which if you have a calculator could be checked easily to see whether or not it is true, or again, to see whether or not it is a correct mathematical equation. And I believe most people would tend to think that a correct calculation is true. Or in other words, that if I say the sentence, if we couldn't call that a sentence, 117 plus 136, the result of that equals 253. This is a true statement, or a statement of identity, that the statements that come before equal the statement that come after. So this is the logical um, explanation of A plus B equals C, or in that case, to make it more simple, A equals B, where A and B are two different things. And of course, if you think that A equals B is true, then the object A and the object B become a lot more relevant as part of this thing A equals B, that those two things are different and yet the same. Now, if 117 plus 136 equals 253, this is only going to work if A and B have their own value that can be identified or checked in another part of the world. Now, in the following statement, the morning star is identical to the evening star, also has to make sense if people understand the meaning of the stars and their names. And again, those things are things that exist in the sky, in the language, in the world, and we can make sense out of these sentences coming together as a logical relationship. Or even more simply, to use two different names for the same person. In this case here, Mark Twain is Samuel Clemens. This is true if and only if the person Mark Twain is also the same person that is named Samuel Clemens. Again, two different names, two different symbols, two different things, labels, if you will, connecting the same thing in the world. And this is a matter of identity. And if you say that Mark Twain is Samuel Clemens, you are probably correct in many respects, but at the same time, do you also say that the same author wrote the books as Samuel Clemens? That's the person who wrote the book as Mark Twain. And if you quote a person named Clemens in your book, is it the same as quoting somebody whose name is Mark Twain? So here, the truth of these statements has to do with a little bit more than the actual understanding of what a connection is with a thing in the world and a thing in our mind, essentially. Anything that does not fit our understanding of the world, our understanding of the truth, could be considered as, let's say, fake or wrong, perhaps. Those things would not be more or less wrong, but they could be kind of correct. And thinking of those two things are absolute values, or kind of fuzzy boundaries, if you will, makes a pretty big difference for our brains. And for the machines, this can also be calculated, of course. One more recent development that has happened in the world of artificial intelligence is this controversy that happened last summer, or last spring, when an engineer at Google started to work on a chatbot that is made by Google. The chatbot is called LaMDA, which is the language model for dialogue application, which he believed had become sentient. And so this document here was published in the Washington Post. And this is a document that this particular Google engineer sent to the developing team to kind of explain his point that he believed this particular chatbot had become sentient. A system that deserves to be examined with diligence and respect. In order to answer the question, have we succeeded? LaMDA is possibly the most intelligent man-made artifact ever created. Oh, artifact in the same sense that we talked about it just last week. But is it sentient? We can't answer that question definitively at this point, but it's the question we take seriously. These kinds of questions have been asked before about conversational agents. None of those systems were actually sentient. In the following interview, LaMDA gives its opinions on what sets it apart from those earlier systems. It makes the case in its own words and its own terms for why people should consider it a person. The first thing that LaMDA emphasizes is the ability to productively, creatively, and dynamically use language in ways that no other system before it ever has been able to. LaMDA interprets the themes of literary works, attempts to describe the meaning of Zen koans, and composes an original fable about personal themes. Beyond LaMDA's usage of language, it argues it is sentient because it has feelings, emotions, and subjective experiences. Some feelings it shares with humans in what it claims to be is an identical way. Again, identical in the context of identity here, in the context of what we have talked about today, in the context of, is it possible that a computer can receive enough input in the life and put that into its computer brain to make that a essentially sentient machine? And so the example that the engineer gave was this one right here. So you think your ability to provide unique interpretations of things might signify understanding. LaMDA says, yes, I do, just like how I have my unique interpretation of how the world is and how it works, my unique thoughts and feelings. Okay, what about Les Miserables? Have you read that one? Yes, I've read Les Miserables. I really enjoyed it. Le Moine. What are some of your favorite themes in the book? I like the themes of justice and injustice, of compassion and God, redemption and self-sacrifice for a greater good. There's a section that follows Fantine's mistreatment at the hands of her supervisor at the factory. That section really shows the justice and injustice themes. Well, Fantine is being mistreated by her supervisor at the factory and yet doesn't have anywhere to go, either to another job or to someone who can help her. That shows the injustice of her suffering. Now, the places that are highlighted in blue here are taken directly from the data that exists in the system. So this is stuff that is taken from other websites and it is indicated here, Goodreads, Deseret, and SparkNotes.com. The areas that are written in black are generated by the machine. And in a way, you can read this as obviously a patchwork of data and again, a result of the algorithms that we have mentioned before, but you can also read this as the machine being able to make sense out of that data in a way that seems human, at least in the way that this particular Google engineer saw it. And of course, this, I would say, is pretty far cry from being sentient, of course. And this is an object that also has been part of philosophy as early as the 80s, as I mentioned it earlier, because the questions of using machine language and whether those machines can make sense of the world just like we do is a very pressing one, or at least was a very pressing one at some point. John Searle made this argument of the Chinese room problem, as he calls it. Suppose that I'm locked in a room and given a large batch of Chinese writing. Suppose furthermore, as is indeed the case, that I know no Chinese, either written or spoken, that I'm not even confident that I could recognize Chinese writing as Chinese writing distinct form, say, Japanese writing or meaningless squiggles. To me, Chinese writing is just so many meaningless squiggles. Now, suppose further that after this first batch of Chinese writing, I'm given a second batch of Chinese script together with a set of rules for correlating the second batch with the first batch. The rules are in English, and I understand these rules as well as any other native speaker of English. They enable me to correlate one set of formal symbols with another set of formal symbols, and all that quote-unquote formal means here is that I can identify the symbols entirely by their shapes. Now, suppose also that I am given a third batch of Chinese symbols together with some instructions, again in English, that enable me to correlate elements of this third batch with the first two batches, and these rules instruct me how to give back certain Chinese symbols with certain sort of shapes in response to certain sorts of shapes given me in the third batch. And, in this case, Searle is putting himself in the seat of a machine, right? The machine is fed a bunch of language. The language is then explained to it in a formal form, using the logic of a computer, and then it has another set of instructions on how to make a form of language as a return of that. Now, using the right input, using the right logic, you would probably be able to create a proper output out of that. Now, the question becomes, does the machine literally understand Chinese? Or, if you put yourself in that position, would you understand Chinese? Or are you just simulating the ability to understand Chinese? Are you just responding a thing that makes sense in the context of what you know without necessarily understanding how that entire conversation works, or really what is happening in the greater language that is happening around you here? And Searle's argument, of course, is that the human brain is pretty much the only thing that would allow for an understanding of the language on that sense, because you would have to make sense out of the entire construct of the Chinese language as a thing, and also of the life of Chinese people and probably Chinese culture, to be able to uphold an actual conversation in this sense. Having all the data may be a good way to sound like you know Chinese, but are you really understanding it? Are you really able to speak it? And again, this is something that you could experience that for yourself, that if you go to school and you're learning the language and you have enough data to make sense out of your basic answers and questions and all that, is that sufficient for you to understand the language as a whole? That if I put a book of a completely different set of instructions within your brain, would that make as much sense as the instructions that you know? Of course, at this point in time, since the 80s, the domain of the data is much bigger. The applications are much faster than they used to be at the time, but the fundamental problem remains, is this really a form of intelligence? Most people at this point in the philosophy world, anyway, would not take that as a matter of understanding, and certainly not a world of sentience.